Hi there, my name's George and I'm here to sort of talk regarding women's lib and how it's affected society as a whole. Now I have to go into a little bit of a story first, so it gives you some background as to where I'm going with this chat. My father, he emigrated to the UK in 1956 and he was basically a labourer. But when he arrived, he worked very hard, and within a short period of time, he was able to buy his own home. Now, he was doing this with his own salary, because at the time, the hire purchase regulations and loans were such that you could only have one person's salary taken into account, and it was normally the male member of the family who was the breadwinner, so therefore it was the male's wages which were taken into account. Now, this meant that house prices were geared to those sort of salaries. Now, when you roll on a bit further, I come into an age where I get married and I buy my first house. Now, at the time, because we had what was the Burn Your Bra Brigade, women's livers at the time, in the 60s, who clamoured for changes to the arrangements for loans, because women couldn't get a loan that easily unless they had the permission of the male or the father, or etc, etc. You had to have guarantors, and it was really quite complicated. And to some extent they were correct in that they wanted to have the same rights as men. Now, the law was eventually changed gradually. Initially it was changed such that they would take into account half the woman's wage if she was working. So this is more or less when I bought my first house, and my wife's wages were taken into account, and I was able to buy a house for £4,500. Wasn't a very big house, but it was £4,500. I was struggling to pay it at the time. Now, clamouring still carried on with regards to women's livers, and eventually the law was changed such that they would take the full woman's wage into account, which meant that a woman could then get a loan on her own if she wished to, which was the original purpose of all their boycotts and all their voices being heard in Parliament, etc. The net result, of course, was that all of a sudden now, the house that I owned, which cost £4,500, within about 3.5 years, 4 years, had doubled in price. It was now up for sale for £9,600. Now, that house wasn't worth £9,600. It was still only worth more or less £4,600, which I paid for it. The thing was that because we now had a second wage earner, that the loan companies were able to equate that in, and all of a sudden you could borrow more. So now all of a sudden, instead of you'd be able to buy a much bigger and better house, you ended up buying the same house for double the price. Now, at the time I moved on and I bought a house for £15,500 because again I took my wife's wages completely into account this time, and therefore we could afford a much bigger house. But that house itself had also gone up in price. It had doubled. Now, the likes of the Duke of Westminster were absolutely over the moon. All house owners who owned a house at the time couldn't believe their luck. Without lifting a finger, they doubled their wealth. Doubled their wealth. Why? Because now you had 2 slaves instead of 1 being able to work to buy the same house. So women's lib didn't actually do anybody any favours. It made us all having to work harder to buy the same piece of property which 4 or 5 years earlier was half the price. And now this has carried on since and has got actually worse. Because as you know, house prices today are astronomical, and it's only because you can borrow more. Now, had they not changed the laws on borrowing, house prices today would be a pittance in comparison. Anyway, so I'll leave the house thing now for the moment. The other effect that this changes to the borrowing laws made is that now women were having to work to be able to buy the house, which then meant that the majority of them started putting off having children. Now this more or less carried on for about 10 to 15 years, but then when women started getting to what I would say is their sell-by date, 35 years of age, a lot of them started to panic and then started to have children because they realised they might not be able to if they left it any longer. So we had this 15-year gap where the population had basically come to standstill. And that result was that we ended up having to let more immigration in, and at the same time the pensions were under the hammer because there weren't people contributing. Also, the people that were born after 15 years didn't start working until 15 years later. So you're looking at like a 30-year stretched out gap of the housing, employment market being under stress, and invariably the pensions were under stress because there weren't that many contributions in comparison to what we had before. The government then, obviously, in their wisdom, had to find a solution. So the only solution they could think of was they extended our pensions from 65 to 67 for men, and women got really hammered from 60 to 67. So theirs was increased by 7 years. Now, this is an effect that nobody could foresee, but it's actually happened, and it all stems from the fact that we were asking for too much, and in the end we've shot ourselves in the foot. How to reverse it, I don't know, but women's lib should be now looking at a totally different direction, in that they should be trying to get back to what they've lost, because they've lost a lot. They lost their freedom, they lost the rights to be able to take care of their children properly. A lot of children end up being in nurseries and what have you from a very early age. I mean, you don't bring up children like that properly, not in my day anyway. So the next effect has been negative, very negative. I'm just going to go now on to equal pay, which has been the last one that's been going on. Now, equal pay has never existed, even for men. I mean, I worked in an engineering company, and we were all engineers, we all had degrees and what have you, and yet we all had different pay packets because we all had different levels of knowledge and ability, and that was recognised in what you earned. So even though we were all supposedly doing the same job, none of us actually earned the same amount of money. So this thing about equal pay to me is laughable, because it's never existed for men. So why it should now exist for women? Having got to this now where equal pay is being thrust upon us, you'll find that everybody's going to be on the minimum wage, because that is the equal pay limit, the minimum wage. The other net effect is that women unemployment is going to rise drastically, because if an employer has a man and a woman applying for the same job, he'll probably pick the man because he has less problems with the man in the workplace. I know it seems a bit unfair, but that's the reality of life. So all of this clamouring for equal pay, again, I think is going to shoot yourselves in the foot, because you're going to be unemployed. And my last and most controversial thing is of course, with all this equal rights responsibility, I think it should be born in. Women should be very careful, because if there's ever another world war, the last two world wars were fought by men, and we lost millions on the Western Front and in all the wars during World War II, where men volunteered to protect their wives and their children back at home. Now, with all these equal rights, it's only fair that women should go to the front, and then we men can stay at home and do the dishes. I'll leave you with that, and God bless us all.